get into more technical nitty-gritty personalized issues if you guys have questions. So Austin is going to screen share too with the contract so you guys can kind of see what I'm talking about, where I'm talking about, if you haven't had the opportunity to print a contract to go through. So line 1 of the contract, probably one of the biggest issues I see more often than not is in regards to the seller's name. So if you have an individual, pretty straightforward, you just put that individual's name. However, a lot of times I see that the seller's name is an individual when in reality a trust or an LLC or a corporation owns the property. So the quickest way to verify who actually or what actually owns the property is to pull the vesting deed from the property appraiser's website. You can do that very easily for Sarasota or on Manatee, just because that's typically the areas that I work with. But you pull that, I can show you how to do it via email if you guys have never done that before. But that way you can see exactly how the sellers took property when they purchased it. And that name needs to mirror on the contract so that you don't ever run into any enforceability issues down the road. In regards to buyer, you can kind of piggyback this with the assignability section. Make sure you're having a conversation with your buyers, if that's who you're working with, on how they plan to take title to the property. If it's an individual, again, pretty straightforward, but if they are thinking of putting it into an LLC, if it's an investment property, make sure that they have formed that LLC or that corporation, or they know what trust it's going into, and the trust is up to date in the state of Florida for out-of-state buyers as well. If you leave the assignability section 7, where it says may assign but not be released from liability, more often than not, sellers don't have issues with that, just because it's still locked into the contract. You just are not leaving any liability open. When you pull that vesting deed too, it also will show you the legal description. So for 1C, a lot of times I see that the short form legal is used from the property appraiser's website. Use the actual legal description listed on that vesting deed, because it doesn't happen very often, but I have seen it and the firm has seen it where the short form legal is actually wrong. So again, you don't want to run into any enforceability issues down the road if you know what hits the fan halfway through the contract and you have an attorney representing each side, or if an agent notices, hey, that's not the right legal description, that's a pretty easy out and your client is probably not going to be very happy with you. So moving down in regards to personal property, D&E section 1, if you are working with buyer or seller and it's a cash transaction and a significant amount of property is going to convey with that purchase, use an inventory list so there is no questioning on what exactly is conveying. I see TVs all the time and washer and dryer. Washer and dryer and microwave are not listed in 1D. And for some reason, I think everybody thinks they are. So that's a very common issue that I see at the closing table. They go through their walkthrough and say washer dryer aren't there, or washer and dryer are there, and they were expecting it or they weren't expecting it. So make sure you're going through that personal property, putting what's included, putting what's excluded, and setting those expectations right at the beginning so that buyer and seller know either what they're getting or what they're supposed to be taking with them. Excuse me. All right, so moving down to where escrow agent is, number 2. Never leave that blank either. I see sometimes TBD. Technically, we've had an argument that if the TBD is still there, you don't have an effective contract because that's a material item of the contract. So whether or not the buyer is picking and paying or the seller is picking and paying, or a lot of brokerages hold escrow themselves, just make sure that you are putting an escrow agent in that contract. So you have the ability for the buyer to know where they're going to be depositing that money. And if the other side of the deal sees who the escrow agent is, they know who they can reach out to obtain information and get the ball rolling on that process. I also want to note, especially with the holiday coming up, we're moving down to number 3, time for acceptance and effective date. Both of those are effective on whether it's a weekend or a holiday. So Memorial Day is this Monday, and if you are working with a buyer or seller and trying to get contract negotiations throughout, remember that if it lands on Memorial Day, it doesn't automatically extend. So it is on that effective date. So if you go under contract on Memorial Day, that is your effective date. If your time for acceptance is Memorial Day, that's your time for acceptance. It doesn't automatically extend till 5 p.m. the next day. Every other day in the contract does, however. So if an escrow deposit is due on a Sunday, that's the day it lands. It obviously piggybacks to that Monday at 5 p.m. is when it's due. Same for inspection. I do want to mention that I get this question a lot. It's not 5 p.m. on the actual date it lands on, though. So just say today was the inspection period deadline on a contract that you're working on. It ends at 11:59 p.m. The only time it ends at 5 p.m. is if it falls on a weekend or a holiday and transfers to the next day. So you get that 5 p.m. But in a normal contract situation when your inspection period is ending or loan approval, those are the two most common issues when they come up. You have 11:59 that evening. So as long as some sort of notice is given on that day, you do have that time. Closing date. I don't like on or before. We run into issues because you get to say, well, who picks? So if it's on or before 6:29 and the buyer says, I'm ready on 6:20 and the seller says, I'm not, then you have a dispute. It's way easier and it takes me 2 seconds, anybody at this firm too, to draft a closing extension or to draft an addendum to bump the closing date up. And that way it's more clear and you don't have an angry seller who is kind of pissed off that they have to move all their stuff, and then a buyer who is upset that they didn't get to move in when they wanted to and have to extend. So I don't like using on or before. I like a typical closing date, standard closing date, and then we're happy to draft an addendum either extending or bumping that closing date up, and that way everybody is on the same page. Moving down onto the second page, I'm going to start talking about financing in a second. I just want to point out on the occupancy section, if you are dealing with an investment property or any sort of property that is subject to a lease after closing, you need to give the buyer that copy of that lease as soon as possible. It's so important. They need, because once the buyer receives that copy of that lease, they have 5 days to decide if they want to terminate the contract if they don't like the lease. And it can be as simple as that. If the buyer sees the terms of the lease and they say, ooh, you know, I don't really like these, they can cancel the contract. So if that seller doesn't give them that lease until 10 days before closing, the buyer can cancel up to 5 days before closing. So the contract says that you should give it to them as soon as possible. Just remember that the buyer does have 5 days after receiving that lease or leases to decide if they want to cancel the contract. So if you're representing a seller or you are working with listings most of the time, that's something that you want to have prevalent in your mind, that you need to be asking for copies of leases. All right, so financing. Financing and repair limits are the biggest meat topics that I'm going to be speaking about today. So cash, obviously, if it's a cash contract, pretty straightforward, no financial obligations. You are moving forward and basically saying, I have the cash, no matter what, we're going to close. I do see when there's a multiple offer situation, buyers sometimes checking cash, even when they're obtaining a loan. Because they say in their mind, you know what, I have the cash, if worse comes to worse, I'll pay cash. So I've probably had 15, 20 of those instances. Not one of them have ever paid cash. They always end up getting the seller to extend to get that mortgage. And usually the seller's not very happy about it. The seller usually ends up doing it, but they're not happy. I like to have happy closings where everybody is smiling at the end of the closing table. So I think it's best to set expectations as easy as possible. So I don't recommend that. Obviously, I know situations are all different, but if you are working with a buyer and they say, you know, I want to make my offer more competitive, let me just indicate cash, but I'm going to get a mortgage. I definitely wouldn't recommend a 30-day close just in case, especially with the current situation that we're at. I've seen loans taking longer, loan approval periods taking longer because we're doing that employment verification. So just be mindful of that when representing a buyer. More often than not, it becomes the agent's fault or my fault if something happens, even if we have instructed them properly. In regards to section B though, so this is where we see the biggest issues. This is about loan approval. And I think the hardest part about this contract is that they don't define what loan approval is. Can you still hear me? All right, okay, sorry, I muted mine because I didn't want to have any background music. Okay, so with loan approval, it doesn't actually define what it is. It just says the buyer has to use good faith and diligent efforts. What does that mean? So that's a litigator's dream because they are open to interpretation, but it's not a transactional attorney's dream, which is what I am. So I always have buyers put the most information they can as possible. So if that buyer wants an FHA loan no higher than 3.5, put that there, because if they end up not being able to get an FHA loan at 3.5, they can still cancel. However, if they leave that interest rate blank, it's just at the prevailing rate based on that buyer's creditworthiness. And they might not want to be purchasing a home if they're getting a 4.75 interest rate. So those blanks are there to protect buyers and to give them the most protection. And I see them blank all the time. So especially be mindful of the calendar days. If it's blank, it's 30 days after effective date. If you have a 90-day close or a 60-day close, having a 30-day loan approval date is not really feasible. I know from a closing agent's perspective and working with lenders all the time, they work on a calendar date. So they're not going to be working on a loan approval for 30 days when it closes 2 months later. They're going to get that loan approval probably 15, 20 days before closing. So if you have a 60 or 90-day closing, just push that loan approval period out to give your buyer more protection. You're going to end up extending it anyways. So it's just better to set that and have one less addendum. And then moving down, I just kind of want to highlight the major things about the financing and loan approval. So the buyer has to use diligent effort and good faith. And what we can really find from the contract is that just means if your lender is asking you, hey, I need you to give me your tax transcripts, or I need you to sign this 4560T, and they just keep putting them off, haven't paid for the appraisal, haven't paid for their application, they're obviously not using good faith and diligent effort. This is a hard thing to argue if you ever run into a situation where loan approval becomes tricky. But the best thing is if you're working with a buyer, just make sure they're on top of everything. They have to apply for a mortgage within 5 days after the contract being effective. I think more often than not, buyers are doing that the day after or sometimes before they actually get the contract executed. The buyer also has a requirement that they have to keep the seller and the seller's broker informed of what's going on. So if for some reason the buyer is not getting the loan approval or it's not looking good or anything like that, the buyer does have an obligation to inform the seller and the seller's broker of what's going on in the situation. Okay. We're going to take a break real quick.
Sorry,
is it not working?
We're having a lot of background noise, so I gotta figure out
Is everybody muted? I mean, I can see this person's not muted.
Can you, anything that you can see, because I can't screen share and see that at the same time.
Am I muted? Okay, I'm back. I purposely muted it. I was trying to fix the background noise. Can you guys type if it's better at all, or if it's not? Just let us know. I guess it still says a lot of background. It says Janet Lynn Elia is talking. I don't know if you can. Janet, can you mute your microphone, please? Okay. Well, I'm gonna keep going, just for intensive purposes. Okay, so back to all right. So moving back to loan approval, I want to mention too that if a buyer does not use diligent effort in good faith, it's considered default. And if a buyer is ever considered in default under a contract, they are at risk for their deposit. So it is an important deadline in the contract that the buyer needs to continue to meet. And so I'm going to use 30 days just for our example here. So what happens if the buyer is unable to obtain loan approval prior to the expiration of their loan approval period? So the contract states that the buyer can either waive their loan approval contingency and move forward as a cash buyer, or they can terminate the contract. So if it's the 29th day of the 30-day loan approval and your lender is just telling you, your credit score is way too low and you don't have enough income and all of these big factors for loan approval, go ahead and tell the seller, hey, I used good faith, diligent effort, but I am going to terminate the contract. Obviously, if you do have the cash and you're able to close, you can do that as well. I don't recommend that prior to what I talked about earlier. But on the flip side of that, the most important thing about loan approval is to make sure that the buyer is not being silent, because silence can kill a deal, and I've seen it happen. It's very a nuanced issue, but if a buyer fails to deliver timely notice of loan approval, or if they fail to deliver written notice, the seller actually has a 3-day window that they can terminate the contract by giving their own notice. And I get the question, well, why would a seller want to do that? If a seller has a backup cash offer for $20,000 more, that's a reason. Or if the seller just doesn't want to sell anymore, that's a reason. So there's that 30 days, and the buyer has to, per the contract, provide written notice to the seller that they either have loan approval or they don't. So if they don't, they can either, again, terminate or they can waive. And if they do have loan approval, they still need to tell the buyer, because if, or pardon me, tell the seller, because if they haven't heard anything by that 33rd day at 4 p.m. and they have a backup offer for $20,000 more, the seller can cancel. The buyer still gets their deposit back, but the buyer is kind of SOL of the contract, and they've lost all that time. They probably spent money on an inspection. They might have moved forward with their appraisal, etc. So if you are working with a buyer or seller, just be mindful of those dates. Here at Berlin Patent, we calendar those dates from the get-go when we get a contract. That is a bold highlighted date on the processor, the closer, and the attorney screen. So we are reaching out 4 to 5 days prior to loan approval being expired, asking the lenders, asking the realtors, asking the buyers, how are you doing on loan approval? If it seems like they're not doing too well, they might need a couple extra days. We are writing an extension and getting all parties agreeable to moving forward on that. So that's what I want to talk about financing. So that's what I see, the ins and outs. Just be mindful of the biggest fluctuation financing. Not do that. You have to say whether you are moving forward or whether you're not, because if you don't, the seller does have that 3-day window to cancel the contract if they want. Section 9. I get this question a lot from agents, from buyers, from sellers. When we send out that preliminary settlement statement for their review, sellers say, why am I paying the estoppel fee? Or why am I paying the doc stamps? And then on the other side, the buyer will ask, well, why am I paying this? Why am I paying that? The contract in Section 9 actually shows what the buyer and seller are going to be paying on that settlement statement. So if you ever have a, difficult buyer or seller who's really going back and forth with you on fees, it's great to just show them the contract that they've already signed, showing where they've agreed to pay that. So estoppel fees is probably the biggest thing that I see, because the sellers don't understand that that's something they're usually paying for, but that is in the contract. It's a seller paid fee. That's what they're going to pay. I wish they were cheaper, but they're not. So moving down to the title evidence deadline, I want to just make you guys aware of this, because I think it's probably the #1 overlooked issue. It's line 159 at the very bottom of page 3 of the contract. So this title evidence and insurance deadline, if it's left blank, it's 15 days for a finance deal. If it's left blank for a cash, it's 5 days, and that's prior to the closing date. And so what that means is a closing agent has to have the survey ordered, the survey reviewed, the title commitment ordered and received back, and the title commitment reviewed prior to that. So the thing is with surveys is not a lot of times buyers want to order a survey until their inspection period is over, or if they've been negotiating repairs and they know they're moving forward, which is understandable. A survey is a big fee, and a buyer doesn't want to pay that unless they know they're moving forward. However, with a 30-day close, if that's left blank, an inspection period is 15 days, that survey needed to be ordered 10 days ago. So it's so important, because we see a lot of survey issues, and if that survey is not ordered and received back by the closing agent before that period, then the buyer loses their ability to object if there is a survey issue. So that means if we got the survey back 5 days prior to closing for a finance deal, and there's a massive building setback line encroachment, too bad. The buyer has to deal with it and keep it because they missed their title evidence deadline. My tip is to always throw 1 in that blank. No matter if it's cash deal, no matter if it's a finance deal, put a 1 there. Like I said, I think it's the most overlooked section of the contract. I don't think anybody is going to fight you back and say, no, I don't want 1. And why it's good to have that 1 is because that means the closing agent and the buyer has all the days except for the previous day prior to closing to review that title commitment, to get that survey ordered. And that's way more feasible, especially on a 30-day close. That means the buyer has their time to go through the inspection. You can order that survey the day after the inspection report if they're moving forward, and that still gives the surveyor a week to get that survey done, and it still gives the closing agent a few days to review the survey. So I always advise to put 1 there. I don't think you can go wrong, and I don't think anybody's really going to notice if you put 1 there either. So I want to touch base section F on page 4 about special assessments. If you're dealing with a condominium, this special assessment section is not the same thing. So this 9F in special assessments on the standard and the as-is contract deals to municipal special assessments, public body special assessments. It doesn't include a condo or an HOA. So I see this frequently when we get an estoppel back and there's a $10,000 special assessment and 9F was checked and it says, well, the seller will pay installments prior and the buyer will pay after. That has nothing to do with the condominium. So this is only really pertinent we see with sewer somewhere around Sarasota County and Longboat Key special assessments. So those are really the only times we see that come into play. Any other type of special assessment dealing with a condo or an HOA, it discusses that in the condo or an HOA rider. So just be mindful of that. All right, and then now we're going to go to sections 11 and 12 at the bottom of page 5. And this is the most difference in the as-is versus standard contract. So same thing, buyer has, if left blank, 15 days for that inspection period. In that inspection period, the buyer can get any inspection they want done. And then prior to the expiration of that inspection period, they have to provide the seller with any repairs that they are requesting to be made. However, I think what happens more often than not is buyers get these inspection reports back. A laundry list of things pop up and they send it over to the listing agent and say, have your seller fix this. Well, that's definitely not the way it's supposed to go, especially in the standard contract. And the only thing that the seller is required to fix in a standard contract is what the general repair items are. And what that means is there's items that need to be brought into working condition. And if they're not in working condition, they need to be brought up. If it's solely a cosmetic condition, that doesn't need to be fixed ever by a seller. The seller also has a property maintenance requirement, and what that means is if the property looks like X on day one of the effective date, it needs to look like X on the closing date as well. Obviously, there's ordinary wear and tear, but if on the day of the effective contract, there was not a big gash in the carpet, and then on closing date there is, the seller has to fix that. That's that maintenance requirement. So 12B2, which is at the very top of page 6, really discusses what the seller has to fix and what they don't have to fix. It defines maintenance, and it defines working condition, and it defines cosmetic conditions. So this 12B2 section is key for the standard contract. So I want to touch base first because I see this almost weekly about the life of roof, that, oh, my inspection came back and the roof only has 2 years left or 1 year left, so the seller definitely has to fix that. False. The contract states, I believe it's the last line, yeah, the 290, starting at 289 to 291, it states that limited roof life is not a defect that the seller must repair or replace. So a way to kind of go around that, especially if you're working with a cash buyer, is to attach that insurance rider, because I know some insurance agents will not insure a roof or insure a home if there's limited roof life. So it's a bit tricky, because if you're paying cash and you know you want to buy an insurance, obviously the contract is stating that limited roof life isn't something the seller has to fix, while on the other hand your insurance agent is saying, well, too bad you don't get insurance unless you get a new roof because of the limited roof life. That rider is kind of your catch-all to protect your buyer, that if they can't find insurance, they can pull out due to that limited roof life. But again, so the way to go about the inspection report and the repairs in this contract is your buyer gets your inspection report back. Again, they're still within those 15 days. Go through that inspection report with their agent, and they pick out what's not in working condition, and that's their starting place. So once they go through and they are going through what's in working condition, what's not in working condition, write those lists of what's not in working condition down. Then you can send that to the listing agent. Say, these are what's not in working condition. This is what needs to be replaced by the seller. Obviously, this is when the repair limits come into place. So once the buyer sends that list to the seller prior to the 15-day period expiring, the seller then has 10 days to either get repair estimates for those repairs or to get a new inspection completed if they don't agree with the buyer's inspection report. So prior to the end of those 10 days, the seller will go back and provide the repair estimates to the buyer. So after that, there's another 5-day window. And if you're thinking, how does all of this happen in a 30-day close? That's why it's very tricky and technical. But so you get the repair limits, and for all intents and purposes, we're just gonna say it's a $2,000 limit. So if those repairs come in anything less than $2,000, the seller is paying them, you guys are moving forward, the buyer can't cancel the contract because they're less. You're stuck in the contract, they're moving forward. On the flip side, if the repairs come back at $2,200, 2 options can happen, and then there's a third as well. So if there's that $2,200, the seller can provide written notice to the buyer and say, hey, Mr. Buyer, I will pay that $2,200, that extra $200, and let's move forward. There we go. If the seller agrees to that, buyer cannot cancel. Or the buyer can say, you know, Mr. Seller, these are the $2,000 I want for you to fix, and then the other $200 remaining, I'll accept that in their as-is condition, or I'll pay for them. There we go. Lastly, so both of those items had to be discussed in a 5-day period. If by the end of 5 days, neither buyer nor seller has agreed in written notice to either pay the extra or to accept an as-is contract, the seller or buyer can terminate. So if you can move down a little bit to line 300 to 308, this is the most hyper-technical area of this contract. And I think it's what gets people tripped up all the time. So a lot of times you hear, oh, well, standard contract, they're stuck. There's absolutely no way a buyer or seller can get out. That's not true. And the way that's not true is because of this, from lines 300 to 308. If buyer nor seller provide written notice about anything that they're either going to accept as is, or if the seller is going to pay, either party can cancel the contract, buyer gets their deposit back, they move forward. So I've had that happen once. It was pretty cool from a contract nerd standpoint, but you obviously want to be mindful of that, because you do have those 5-day windows that either the seller is going to elect to move forward and pay that, or the buyer will elect to accept as is, or they can both cancel. Being mindful of your time. So just briefly, I want to talk about buyer default and attorney's fees. So section 15 and 17. I want to remind you that if a buyer is going to default or a seller is going to default, just remind them of that attorney privilege and the attorney fee provision, because if the prevailing party, the non-prevailing party pays their attorney's fees. So a lot of times when you get just a, bad contract, the buyers and sellers are not liking each other, and buyer says, I want to default, I don't really care, I'm going to sue the buyer, or I'm going to sue the seller. Just show them to that attorney fee provision, because once you show them that, hey, if you lose, you're also paying the prevailing party's fees, that's $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 easy, depending on the purchase price. And once you kind of throw that or show that to them, they might be a little bit more hesitant to breach. And then on page 9, the section 18, just about title exams. So if you go down to, line 462, when a title commitment comes back to the closing agent has 5 days to review that title commitment and either object to it to the seller or accept it. So that's what we are doing. We do that on behalf of the buyer. If we're representing the buyer, we get that title commitment back. The closer's reviewing it and the attorney's reviewing it together, and we make sure that the seller is going to be able to convey marketable title to the buyer. If there is anything a bit funky on that title commitment, we have to object to it within those 5 days. And if we don't, the buyer accepts title as is. And that's not something that the buyer wants to do, obviously, if there's a lis pendens, meaning foreclosure, or if there is a prior deceased seller and we need a death certificate, all of that. So if there is something along the lines that is a title defect, the contract already affords 30 days for the seller to remedy that title defect. So it's built into the contract. The seller has 30 days to work around and provide that clean and marketable title to the buyer. If for some reason it's not looking like 30 days is enough, the buyer has 3 options, and that's how they can choose to move forward. They can either agree to extend the closing date for up to 120 days, and that can give the seller a lot more time. So we see that pretty frequently with probate. If something needs to be probated and it was never started, that gives the seller's attorney on the estate side time to do that. Or the buyer can accept title as is, never do that, please never do that, or the buyer can cancel. So if you're at the end of that cure period on the 30 days and the seller is like, I don't think I can get this corrective deed signed, or I can't figure out how to cure this title, then the buyer can cancel, get their deposit back, and they move forward. Buyer and seller are released from their obligations in the contract. So just be mindful of that. We do that for you. It's not something that the buyer is required to do here at Berlin Patent and any other closing agent. They do that on your behalf as well. And then just a couple more things, and then we can go into question and answers. For addendums and anything that's going to be a party to the contract, Austin, I'm at section, but it's about that modifications to the contract need to be in writing. So P, it's on the bottom of page 11. So an email is not proper to change a closing date, even if both parties are on the email. It needs to be signed by buyer and seller in writing and executed by all parties to be bound by it. So I just want you guys to remember that and be mindful of it. There is no modification or change to the contract that's valid or binding unless it's in writing and it's signed by both parties, and that's how it's bound. And then lastly, just about additional terms. If you guys ever have any additional terms that you want to be written into the contract, I strongly urge you to reach out to a real estate attorney that you work with, to me, to any other attorney at Berlin Patton Ebling. We are here to draft language for you. That's what we went to law school for. And your broker would appreciate if we did it as opposed to you, less liability for you and the broker. So that's something that we offer full service, even if we are not working on the contract at that time. If you have something that's a little tricky, or even if it's not tricky, just a simple statement, reach out to me, reach out to any other attorney here. We can draft that language for you so that your buyer or seller is best protected, and doesn't open you up to liability. That's what we have our bar license for. So, all right, 43 minutes. Do we have any questions?
Yes, open your Q&A.
Okay.
Elizabeth Rose, and let me.
Okay. Hi, Elizabeth Rose. I see your question, and can anybody else read that too?
No, you're gonna have to.
Okay, so I'm going to read the question. If a buyer changes the type of mortgage they're obtaining that differs what was specified in the contract, is there a risk that the seller can cancel? Do you recommend amending the contract? Yes. If a conventional loan is checked off and the buyer is obtaining FHA, that's not the same thing at all. An FHA and a VA loan opens the seller up to more liability and more things that they need to do. So no matter if it's changing from FHA to conventional or whichever, you need to amend the contract, and you need to state that buyer is getting an FHA mortgage as opposed to conventional or anything like that. It's a little bit less likely that if it actually went to litigation, but they have way more of fuel to say that they can cancel if the buyer comes back and says, hey, I can't get loan approval for this FHA, and the seller looks at the contract and says, well, you said conventional. That's way more clear cut, in my opinion, and it gives the litigators more fire to say, you know, the buyer wasn't giving good faith and diligent effort, and then that's default. So if there's any change to the contract, make sure you're making both parties aware of it and you are having an addendum to the contract. That's my recommendation on that. So I'm seeing some questions in the chat too. So I'm just gonna read through that real quick. We touched a lot on surveys, common to be done in most properties during contract year. Coming from Tennessee. Yes, so hi Tori. In regards to surveys, if a buyer is obtaining a loan, they are required to get a survey in order to get what's called a Florida Clear Form 9. The lenders require a survey. So if you're ever working with a buyer who's obtaining financing, they need a survey. If the seller has a prior survey, the buyers can use that. If the seller gives the survey to the buyer, the underwriter still has to approve it, and we still have to approve it too. And we can only use that survey if the seller hasn't made any changes. So if the seller has built a pool or some sort of concrete pad or deck, then we have to get a new survey. I'd say with cash buyers, it's about 50-50. They're not required legally to get a survey per the terms of the contract. Usually the higher purchase price, the more likely they are to get a survey, but it's not required if they're paying cash. So hopefully that answers that. Oh, Melody, deadlines. She asked, could you please go over the deadlines again from earlier in your presentation? What is 11:59 p.m. versus 5 p.m. in the calendar days? So every day in this contract and the as-is contract is calendar days. So we don't ever count business days. So if your effective date is a Friday, you are counting that Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. You don't skip over to Monday. So that's what calendar days mean. And in regards to 11:59 versus 5 p.m. So say your escrow deposit is due today, and that's the day it was always due. You have till 11:59. Obviously, it's a little bit difficult with escrow deposits because most attorneys' offices or title agencies close prior to 11:59. But the 11:59 more comes into play for loan approval and inspection. So on the day, if it's a weekday that the inspection period or loan approval is ending, that's 11:59. So if you have a buyer who emails at 11:58 and says on prior to the inspection period ending and says, I cancel the contract, that's good. If they did it at 12:02, not good. So you're past that deadline there. 5 p.m. comes into play when it ends on a holiday or weekend. So say the inspection period or loan approval deadline ended on a Sunday, then it follows to Monday at 5 p.m. So that's when the less hours comes into play, is when it ends on a weekend or a holiday, then you only go to 5 p.m. When you're ending on the actual day itself, it's 11:59 p.m. All right, James, I'm gonna read this real quick because it's long before I read it out loud, so I can hopefully give a little brief summary on it, so bear with me. James, I'm going to email you my answer to this because I feel like there's a lot of moving parts in this and I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So I'm going to have Austin save that question and then I'll email you my response on that if that works.
Okay.
Anybody else have any other questions or comments?
Okay, everyone. If anybody has any other questions, please go ahead and submit those. It doesn't look like we do. I know we were having a little bit of difficulty at the beginning. There's some background noise. Hopefully we got that solved for everybody. But what I am going to do is I have recorded this into our cloud and I will try to package this up along with all the chat, Q&A and all that kind of stuff. And I will be distributing that video to everyone who is in attendance. So thank you very much. And as always, feel free to reach out to us. I am going to go ahead and type in Mallory's and I's email in the chat, so you guys have that. But I'll go ahead and just go ahead and expect an email from me. That way you'll have our contacts. And if anything arises, you know, after this meeting, feel free to reach out to us and we'd be happy to take care of everybody. So keep an eye out for that email and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi guys, thanks.